The night was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of Richard Caldwell's luxury sedan rolling down the desolate highway. At 72, he had seen the world change in ways he never imagined, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold. As he approached a dimly lit stretch of road, flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. He sighed, pulling over to the side, confused but compliant. The officer who stepped out of the patrol car had a presence that made the air feel heavier. Officer Blake, a man with sharp eyes and a sinister smirk, approached the driver's side window, tapping it twice. Richard rolled it down, offering a polite but puzzled smile. "Evening, officer. Is something wrong?" His voice carried the weight of his years, calm but weary. Blake tilted his head, pretending to think. "You ran a stop sign a few miles back. Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Richard frowned. He knew he hadn't missed any signs, but arguing with law enforcement was never wise. He nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out into the cool night air. That's when he saw it, the glint of steel as Blake unholstered his weapon, his face void of emotion. "This isn't just a traffic stop, Mr. Caldwell," Blake said, voice low and firm. "You're coming with me." Before Richard could react, Blake grabbed his arm, steering him toward the patrol car. The old man's heart pounded, fear creeping into his bones. Something was terribly wrong. Richard's heart pounded as the patrol car rolled onto the bridge, its tires grinding against the worn pavement. The city lights flickered in the distance, but here, on this isolated stretch, darkness ruled. Officer Blake drove in silence, his grip tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched. Richard tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him like an anchor. He wasn't just being arrested. This was something far worse. The car screeched to a stop near the railing. Blake stepped out first, walking around to the passenger side. The door yanked open, and Richard was dragged out into the cold night air. He stumbled, catching himself against the concrete barrier. The river below roared in the silence, black and endless. And Richard turned, his voice trembling. "What is this about? I don't understand." Blake chuckled, shaking his head. "Of course you don't. You're a rich old man who never had to see the dirt people like me crawl through. But tonight, everything changes." Richard's mind raced. This wasn't a simple act of corruption. This was personal. Then Blake pulled a folder from his pocket, tossing it onto the pavement. Papers scattered, and under the dim glow of the patrol car's headlights, Richard saw his own signature forged on legal documents. His estate, his accounts, everything in his name had been altered. Blake leaned in close, whispering, "You're already dead on paper, Richard. Might as well make it official." Before Richard could react, Blake shoved him backward. The old man's body struck the railing, his balance lost. A scream tore from his throat as he plunged into the darkness below. The river swallowed Richard whole. His scream cut short as icy water engulfed him. Ripples spread across the surface, then silence, as if he had never existed. Officer Blake stood at the edge of the bridge, staring down with satisfaction. No struggle, no loose ends, just another nameless body lost to the depths. He took a deep breath, relishing the crisp night air before turning back toward his patrol car. Unseen in the shadows below, a pair of weary eyes had witnessed everything. Samuel, a homeless man who had made his shelter beneath the bridge, had woken to the sound of screeching tires. Hidden behind an old pillar, he had watched the entire scene unfold. Blake's threats, Richard's desperate pleas, and the merciless push that sent the old man into the abyss. Samuel's fingers trembled as he clutched an old, cracked phone. It was a lucky find from the streets, barely functional, but its camera still worked. And now, within its dimly lit screen, it held evidence that could change everything. He crouched lower, pressing himself against the cold concrete. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he dared another glance at the bridge. Blake lingered for a moment, scanning the darkness, as if sensing another presence. Samuel held his breath. If he made a sound, he was as good as dead. Then with a final smirk, Blake turned and walked away, his footsteps fading. The sound of the patrol car's engine roared to life, then disappeared into the distance. Samuel exhaled sharply, gripping the phone tighter. He had spent years being invisible to the world, but tonight he had become a witness to something no one else had seen. And that made him dangerous. Samuel's hands trembled as he stared at the phone screen, the grainy video replaying the horrifying moment over and over. He had spent years in the shadows, ignored by society, but now he held something that could bring a man to justice. His breath came in shaky gasps as he looked up toward the bridge. The cop was gone. The night was silent again, but the weight of what he had just witnessed clung to him like a heavy chain. His mind raced. He couldn't go to the police. Blake was one of them. And if he had killed a rich man without hesitation, what would he do to a homeless nobody like Samuel? He had to be smart. He had to find someone who would listen before Blake realized there had been a witness. Pulling his ragged coat tighter around him, Samuel slipped away from the riverbank, moving fast but careful not to draw attention. The city was never truly asleep, and soon he found himself near a rundown diner, its neon sign flickering in and out. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The warmth hit him first, followed by the curious gazes of a few late-night customers. Ignoring them, he walked straight to the back booth, where a woman sat hunched over a laptop. Sarah Monroe, an investigative journalist, had built her career exposing corruption, but even she wasn't prepared for what Samuel showed her. She took the phone, her expression hardening as she watched the footage. When the video ended, she looked up, her voice a whisper. "This is murder." Samuel swallowed hard. "And that cop, he doesn't know I saw him, but if he finds out—" Sarah nodded, already typing on her laptop. "Then we make sure the world sees this before he even knows what's coming." The city woke up to chaos. News stations, social media, and headlines exploded with the shocking footage of Officer Blake shoving an elderly millionaire off the bridge. The video, grainy but undeniable, played on every screen. The world saw the fear in Richard Caldwell's eyes, the cruel smirk on Blake's face, and the moment he pushed a defenseless man into the abyss. The internet turned into a battlefield of outrage. The police department scrambled to respond, but it was too late. Blake had been exposed. Blake, sitting in his apartment, felt his stomach twist as he scrolled through the news. His phone buzzed non-stop, calls from fellow officers, superiors, and unknown numbers. He was no longer in control. His hands clenched into fists. Someone had been there that night. Someone had seen. A knock at the door made him jump. He reached for his gun, his mind racing, but before he could react, the door burst open. Officers swarmed in, guns drawn. "Blake Reynolds, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Richard Caldwell," a voice commanded. Blake barely had time to process the words before he was forced to the ground, handcuffs tightening around his wrists. Attempted. The words stuck in his throat. Then from the hallway, slow footsteps echoed. A figure stepped into view. Richard Caldwell, alive. His face was bruised, his arm in a sling, but his sharp eyes locked onto Blake with quiet fury. "You should have made sure I was dead," he said calmly. Blake's body went cold. The fall should have killed him. The river should have swallowed him whole. But Richard had survived. Rescued by a fisherman downstream, he had stayed silent, waiting for the right moment. And now, with the world watching, justice had arrived. As officers dragged Blake away, Richard turned to the man standing in the shadows, Samuel. Their eyes met, and for the first time in years, Samuel felt seen. Richard stepped forward and extended a hand. "You saved my life," he said. Samuel hesitated, then shook it. "Guess that makes us even." Richard chuckled. "Not even close." A week later, Samuel stood in front of his own apartment, his name on the lease, courtesy of Richard. For the first time in years, he had a home. He had a chance. As he looked up at the city skyline, he smiled. The night he had witnessed a murder had changed everything, but in the end it had saved 2 lives, his and Richard's.